The day my wife told me my 86-year-old father could miss a hospital procedure because she needed her SUV clean for a client meeting, I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a door, threaten a divorce, or give her the speech I had probably been rehearsing in my head for years without realizing it. I borrowed a car, got my father where he needed to go, and remembered the exact sentence she used because something in me knew I would hear it again someday. She had looked straight at me and said, "He's your father. Handle it yourself." By the next afternoon, my phone showed 27 missed calls from her, and not one of them was asking whether my father was all right. My name is Samuel Hartley. I was 64 that spring, living outside Knoxville, Tennessee, in the same modest brick house I had bought after my first marriage ended more than 20 years earlier. I had spent most of my adult life running Hartley Heating and Air, a company that never got big enough to make me rich but got steady enough to put food on the table, send my daughter through nursing school, and let me start taking Wednesdays off once I hit 62. My father, Harold, lived 9 miles away in a white ranch house with green shutters and a pecan tree that had cracked his driveway in 3 places. He had been a high school shop teacher for 38 years. He could sharpen a hand plane by touch, fix a screen door without measuring twice, and tell from the sound of an engine whether a belt was loose before most mechanics got the hood open. After my mother died, he became quieter but never helpless. That distinction matters. My father did not call me because he was lonely every afternoon. He did not expect me to mow his yard, manage his money, or bring groceries unless the weather was bad. He still drove himself to church, still changed the furnace filter on the first Saturday of every 3rd month, and still refused to let me pay when we ate breakfast at Miller's Diner. If he asked for something, it was because he actually needed it. My wife, Meredith, knew all of that. She had known my father for 14 years. She had eaten his smoked ribs, borrowed his ladder, used his truck when hers was in the body shop, and spent 5 Christmas mornings at his house before deciding 2 years earlier that holidays were easier if we stayed home. Meredith was 57 and owned a home staging and interior design business called Alder House Design. She was good at it. I want to say that clearly because there is no point turning someone into a cartoon just because a marriage ended badly. Meredith had an eye for rooms. She could walk into a dark little house with orange carpet and make it look like someplace a young family could imagine raising children. She worked hard, remembered clients' birthdays, and could turn a warehouse full of mismatched chairs into something people called curated. But there was another side of her that became more noticeable after the business started doing well. She began measuring people by how useful they were to whatever she was trying to accomplish that week. A friend who canceled lunch because her child was sick became unreliable. A contractor who could not squeeze in a last-minute paint job became someone who doesn't understand business. My daughter, Megan, once changed a Sunday dinner because of a 12-hour hospital shift, and Meredith spent the rest of the evening saying nurses were always acting like nobody else has a job. I noticed those things. I just had a habit of sanding down sharp edges in my own mind. I told myself Meredith was stressed. I told myself marriage meant giving each other room to be imperfect. I told myself that a sarcastic remark was not a character flaw and that peace in a house mattered more than winning every disagreement. If you are a husband who has spent years trying to keep everybody comfortable, you know how easy it is to confuse patience with avoidance. My father saw more than I did, but he never spoke against my wife. The most he ever said was one afternoon when Meredith left his birthday dinner early because a client had texted her about curtain samples. He watched her taillights disappear and said, "That woman is always in a hurry to get somewhere important." I asked him what that was supposed to mean. He just smiled and said, "Nothing, son. Eat your pie before the ice cream melts." At the time, I thought he was being old-fashioned. I understand him better now. The trouble started on a Tuesday in May. My father had been waiting almost 7 weeks for an outpatient procedure at Fort Sanders Regional after his eye doctor found pressure behind his left eye and wanted a specialist to look at it under sedation. It was not an emergency, and I want to make that clear. Nobody was having a heart attack. Nobody needed an ambulance. The hospital had simply told us that because they would be sedating him, he could not drive himself home afterward, and they would not release him without a responsible adult signing him out. I had written the date on the calendar over my desk and blocked the entire afternoon. At 11:30 that morning, I left a service call in Powell and climbed into my truck. It turned over once, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. One of my technicians, Luis came outside, listened for about 10 seconds, and told me the fuel pump had probably quit. Normally that would have been irritating, not disastrous. We had a spare van at the shop, but another technician had taken it to Oak Ridge because an elderly customer's air conditioner had failed, and the afternoon temperature was supposed to hit 90. I checked the time. My father needed to be at the hospital by 1:15. Meredith's SUV was at home, 9 minutes away. I called her before I even left the parking lot. She answered on the fourth ring and sounded distracted. I told her what happened. "I need your SUV for about 3 hours," I said. "Dad has that procedure today. I'll fill the tank and have it back before dinner." There was a pause. Then she said, "No, Sam. I have the Barnett presentation at 3. I knew about the presentation. It was for a couple building a house near Tellico Village. I also knew she planned to meet them at her studio, which was 4 miles from our house. "I can drop you at the studio first," I said. "Or Megan can bring the SUV back after Dad's discharged. I just need to get him there on time." Meredith sighed the way people do when they think you are failing to understand something obvious. "I have fabric books, 2 lamps, and that console sample in the back. I'm not unloading everything because your father scheduled something in the middle of my workday." I reminded her he had not chosen the appointment time. The specialist's office had. She said, "Then he can reschedule." I felt myself go still. He waited 7 weeks. "Sam, I have a business to run. And he has a medical procedure. He's your father. Handle it yourself." The words were not shouted. That was what made them so clear. There was no heat behind them, no accident of temper, no apology trying to form before she finished speaking. She meant exactly what she said. My father was my problem. Her clients were her problem. And the fact that she had a working vehicle 10 minutes away did not create any obligation in her mind. I said, "All right." She immediately started explaining that I was being dramatic, but I told her I had to go, and ended the call. There was a man across the parking lot, loading copper tubing into an old Chevy Colorado. His name was Curtis Bell. He had worked for me on and off for 16 years before retiring, and that morning he had stopped by to pick up a thermostat I had ordered for his church. Curtis was 71, had arthritis in both hands, and wore hearing aids that squealed whenever his phone got too close to his left ear. He saw my face and asked what was wrong. I gave him the shortest version possible. My truck died. My father needed a ride to a procedure. Before I even got to the part about looking for a rental, Curtis tossed me his keys. I told him I could not take his truck. He said, "You can either take it or waste 10 more minutes arguing with an old man who already decided." I tried to tell him I would bring it back by 5. He shook his head and said, "Bring your dad home safe. I'll get Luis to take me to the church." That was the first moment something in me shifted. My wife had spent 14 years calling my father family. Curtis was not related to him at all. Yet one of them saw a problem and immediately looked for a way to help. The other saw the same problem and protected the clean cargo space in her SUV. I drove to my father's house, and he was waiting on the porch in a blue windbreaker even though the day was warm. He had his insurance card in a little envelope, a paperback Western tucked under one arm, and a plastic grocery bag with 2 oatmeal cookies because he thought hospital food was how they punish you for getting sick. He climbed into Curtis's truck and asked where mine was. I told him the fuel pump had quit. He looked at the seat, recognized the truck, and said, "This Curtis Bell's?" I said yes. He nodded once. "Good man." I did not tell him anything else. The procedure went fine. The specialist found no tumor, no bleeding, and nothing that required surgery. My father had elevated pressure that could be treated with medication and follow-up visits, which was about as good an outcome as we could have hoped for. I sat in the recovery area while the sedative wore off, and when the nurse asked him what day it was, he said, "Tuesday, unless this hospital bill is high enough to make it Christmas." She laughed. I laughed. He looked pleased with himself. On the way home, we stopped at Miller's Diner because he had not eaten since the night before. He ordered eggs, white toast, and coffee, then complained that decaf was hot brown water pretending to have a job. I watched him spread strawberry jam on his toast with hands that shook just slightly more than they had a year earlier, and a wave of guilt went through me so suddenly I had to look out the window. It was not guilt because Meredith had refused us the SUV. I had solved that. It was guilt because I had spent years assuming my father would always be sturdy enough not to notice how people treated him. Age does something strange to the relationship between a son and his father. For most of your life, he is the wall behind you. Then one day, you realize you have become part of the wall behind him. I dropped him at home a little after 6. He insisted on walking me to the driveway, even though the nurse had told him to rest. He put one hand on the roof of Curtis's truck and said, "Tell that man breakfast is on me Saturday." Then he looked at me for a long second and asked, "Where was Meredith's car?" I should have known he would figure it out. My father spent 38 years teaching teenagers how to use table saws without losing fingers. Very little got past him. I told him she had a client meeting. He asked, "Couldn't she spare the car?" I said, "Dad, it's handled." He did not move. That wasn't what I asked. I could have lied. I had done softer versions of lying for years. I could have said there was equipment in the SUV or that her meeting was out of town. Instead, I looked at my father, still wearing the plastic hospital bracelet, and told him the truth. I repeated Meredith's sentence exactly. He did not curse. He did not call her ungrateful. He did not even look surprised, which bothered me more than anger would have. He just stared down at the gravel for a moment and said, "I see." Then he asked if I wanted coffee. I told him no because I needed to get Curtis his truck. My father nodded and went inside. That evening, when I finally got home, Meredith was in the kitchen answering emails. Her SUV was in the garage. The fabric books were stacked neatly on the dining room table, and the 2 lamps she had told me could not be moved were already in the studio because one of her assistants had picked them up after lunch. I did not mention that. Meredith looked at me and asked, "How did it go?" I told her my father was fine. She said, "See? Everything worked out." There are sentences you hear differently once something inside you has moved. Before that day, I might have let those words end the matter. Instead, I asked, "Do you know whose building your studio is in?" She frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "Just answer me," she said. "Your dad's, technically." Technically. That word sat there between us. 5 years earlier, when Alder House Design outgrew Meredith's home office, my father had offered her the storefront he owned on North Central Street. He had bought the building in 1996 with my mother after a hardware store closed. The front half had been a flooring shop for years, then sat empty. The back had storage space, a loading door, and enough parking for Meredith's staging inventory. I knew my father charged her less than market rent. I did not know how much less. That night, for the first time, I pulled up listings for comparable commercial spaces. Meredith was paying $1,200 a month. Similar spaces nearby were listed between $3,200 and $4,000, and most charged extra for storage. I sat at my desk staring at those numbers while she took a shower. Then I remembered something else. During the slow year after interest rates climbed and home sales cooled, Meredith had once told me her landlord had worked with her for a few months. She never said what that meant. The next morning, I called my father and asked. He resisted at first. Then he admitted that when Meredith had trouble making payroll 2 years earlier, he had waived 6 months of rent and told her she could pay him back when business improved. She never did. He had never asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. He answered, "Because she asked me not to. She was embarrassed, and I figured helping family was worth more than making sure everybody knew I helped." I asked how much money she still owed him. He said, "None." I told him that made no sense. He said, "Son, if I expected it back, it would have been a loan. I decided it wasn't. That was my father." And suddenly I understood why the sentence from the day before had landed so hard. Meredith had not simply refused a favor to an elderly man. She had told a man who had quietly subsidized her business for years that his needs were someone else's problem. The next morning, I went to my father's house before work. He was at the kitchen table with his reading glasses low on his nose and 3 envelopes lined up beside his coffee mug. One was from his insurance company, one was from the county, and one had the return address of a property management office. I asked what it was. He said, "Lease renewal." Meredith's 5-year lease on the studio expired at the end of July, 71 days away. The property manager had sent him a reminder the previous week, asking whether he wanted to renew at the current rate, raise the rent, or put the space back on the market. My father had not answered yet because he intended to renew Meredith for another 5 years at almost the same rent. He had even penciled a note on the letter asking whether she needed the back storage area repainted. I sat there looking at that little note and felt something hard settle in my chest. Dad folded the paper, put it back in the envelope, and said, "I'm not renewing it." I asked if he was sure. He said yes. I asked whether he was doing it because he was angry. He said, "Of course I'm angry. I'm old, not dead, but anger isn't why." Then he took a sip of coffee and said, "For 5 years I've been giving her something because I believed family helps family. Yesterday she explained that she doesn't believe that. I'm taking her at her word. I told him Meredith would say he was punishing her." He shrugged. "She can say whatever she needs to say. I'm not throwing her out today. I'm not changing locks. I'm honoring every day of the lease I signed. When it ends, so does the favor." That sentence made more sense to me than anything I had heard in months. He called the property manager while I was still there and told them he would not renew. He also told them not to contact Meredith until they had prepared the formal notice because he wanted everything done properly. No surprise lockout, no threats, no tricks. Just a lease ending on the date printed on the first page. Then my father did something that showed me exactly what kind of man he still was. He asked the property manager to give Meredith first opportunity to negotiate a new lease at market rate if she wanted to stay. The manager estimated the space would bring around $3,500 a month. My father said that was fine. If she wanted it at the same terms any other tenant would receive, she could apply. If not, they would list it. "I don't want revenge," he told me after hanging up. "I want clarity." I left his house thinking about that word, clarity. It was the opposite of the way I had lived much of my marriage, softening every conflict until nobody could see what actually happened. At the shop, I kept busy. My truck was being repaired. Curtis kept making jokes about charging me luxury rental rates for his Chevy, and I almost convinced myself the matter could stay between my father and Meredith. At 2:18 that afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was helping Luis diagnose a compressor. Meredith. I let it ring because my hands were dirty. 2 minutes later, she called again. Then again. By the time I washed up, I had 7 missed calls. I assumed something had happened at the studio, so I called back. She answered before the first ring finished. "What did you tell your father?" she demanded. I said, "About what?" "Don't do that, Sam. The property manager just emailed me. They're not renewing my lease. They want $3,500 a month if I stay. $3,500. Do you understand what that does to my overhead?" I looked at the time on my phone and remembered standing in our kitchen the day before asking for 3 hours with her SUV. "Did you ask Dad why?" I said. "I don't need to ask him. This is you. You went over there and got him worked up because I couldn't drop everything yesterday. He had a hospital procedure. And he got there. That isn't the point. Then what is the point?" I could hear cars passing behind her, which meant she was probably outside the studio. Her voice had that sharp, fast rhythm it got when a client challenged an invoice. I said, "The point is that my father has been charging you about a third of market rent for 5 years. He waived 6 months when you were struggling. He was planning to renew you at almost the same rate. Yesterday you told me he was my responsibility, and you had your own business to worry about. So now he's letting you run your business without a family favor attached to it." Silence. Then she said, "He told you about the 6 months?" That was the first thing she asked. Not whether he was okay. Not whether the procedure found anything serious. She wanted to know what I had learned about the rent. Something in me that had still been looking for a misunderstanding stopped looking. "Yes," I said. "He told me." Meredith said, "That was private." I answered, "Apparently his help was private. Your entitlement to it wasn't." She hung up. Over the next 40 minutes, she called 12 more times. By the time I drove back to the shop office, the total was 21. At 27, I finally answered. She said, "Are you coming home so we can fix this?" I asked what she meant by fix. "You need to talk to him." "About what?" "Tell him this is ridiculous. Tell him he's making an emotional decision that could hurt my company." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the office window at Curtis, laughing with Luis beside my broken truck. Then I said, "Yesterday, when I told you my father needed help, what did you tell me?" She knew. I could tell by how quiet she became. I repeated it anyway. "You said, 'He's your father. Handle it yourself.'" Meredith whispered, "Sam, that's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't. Yesterday he needed 3 hours of transportation. Today you're asking him for tens of thousands of dollars a year in discounted rent. You were right about one thing. He is my father. and he has handled it himself. That evening was the first time Meredith and I had a real argument in years, which probably tells you more about our marriage than I understood at the time. She was waiting in the living room when I got home. Not the kitchen, not her office, but the formal living room we almost never used. She had printed the lease email and highlighted the market rate figure. She had also calculated what moving would cost, what extra rent would do to payroll, and how much business she might lose if clients could not find her easily. Every number she showed me was probably accurate. That was not the problem. The problem was that every sentence began with what my father was doing to her, and none began with what she had done to him. I asked her to tell me one thing. If you could go back to yesterday, would you give me the SUV? She looked irritated. Knowing this would happen? No. Knowing Dad needed the ride. She folded her arms. I already told you. I had a major client presentation. That isn't an answer. I had obligations. So did I. He could have rescheduled. 7 weeks later, if necessary. I nodded. Then I asked, would you apologize to him? Meredith stared at me like I had asked her to confess to a crime. For saying one frustrated thing? For telling an 86-year-old man who has helped you for 5 years that getting to his medical procedure was not your problem. She stood up and began pacing. She said my father was manipulating me. She said he had always resented her success. She said he enjoyed having power over the building and had been waiting for an excuse to use it. I knew that was not true because I had seen the renewal letter with his handwritten note about repainting her storage area. I told her so. That was when she said something I still think about. She said, if he really considered me family, he wouldn't charge me market rent just because his feelings got hurt. I asked, if you really considered him family, why was lending me your car for 3 hours too much? She had no answer. Instead, she told me I was choosing my father over my wife. Maybe she expected that sentence to frighten me back into my old habits. For years it probably would have. But by then, I understood the choice differently. I was not choosing my father over my wife. I was choosing reality over the story I had been telling myself about my marriage. I told Meredith I was not asking Dad to reverse his decision. I told her the lease had 71 days left. The property manager had offered her the same opportunity any tenant would receive, and I would help her move equipment if she chose another location. But I would not pressure my father to keep subsidizing someone who treated his kindness like a bill he owed her. Meredith slept in the guest room that night. For the next week we barely spoke except about practical things. My father never called her. He did not gloat. He did not ask me whether she was panicking. On Saturday, he took Curtis to breakfast and insisted on paying for both of them. Curtis later told me Dad spent half the meal trying to convince him that a Chevy Colorado needed new rear shocks. Meanwhile, Meredith began touring commercial spaces. For the first time, she saw in real numbers what my father's help had been worth. One place wanted $3,800 plus common area fees. Another had no loading door. A third was cheaper but 20 minutes outside town. She came home from those tours angrier, not humbler. She kept saying, your dad has no idea what he's doing to me. Each time I answered, he knows exactly what he was doing for you. 2 weeks later, I arranged a marriage counseling appointment because I did not want to end 14 years without knowing I had tried. In the first session, the counselor asked Meredith what hurt her most about the situation. Meredith said that Sam didn't defend me. When the counselor asked what she thought hurt me most, Meredith was silent for nearly half a minute before saying that I didn't lend him the car. I told her that was only the surface of it. What hurt was discovering that she viewed family as a one-way system. She accepted my father's discounted building, his waived rent, his holiday help, his time, his truck, his advice, and his generosity as part of the background. But the first time helping him required inconvenience. She drew a hard line around what belonged to her. Meredith said, I was keeping score. The counselor asked, is Harold keeping score? Meredith answered, he obviously is if he's ending the lease. I said, no, he stopped keeping score. That's why you thought the favor was permanent. We went to 4 sessions. In the 4th, the counselor asked Meredith whether she would be willing to meet my father and simply acknowledged that her comment had been hurtful. Meredith said she would apologize if he restored the old lease. That was the moment I knew counseling was over. An apology exchanged for discounted rent is not an apology. It is a negotiation. 6 weeks after the hospital appointment, Meredith and I separated. I moved into the small apartment above my company's office. the one I had kept furnished for technicians who came in from out of town. It was not glamorous. The shower pressure was terrible. The refrigerator made a clicking sound at night, and the bedroom window faced the parking lot lights. But I slept better there than I had at home in years. Meredith found another studio before her lease expired, a smaller place off Kingston Pike, with enough room for design meetings but not enough storage for all her staging furniture. She sold some inventory, rented a separate warehouse, and raised her consultation rates. Her business survived. That mattered to me because I never wanted this story to end with her ruined. My father did not want that either. He rented the Central Street building to a physical therapy practice at market rate beginning in September. The extra income covered his property taxes, his supplemental insurance, and the lawn service I had been trying to convince him to hire for 3 years. When he received the first full rent payment, he did not celebrate. He simply looked at the bank statement and said, "Your mother would have told me I was a fool for charging so little all this time." Then he smiled, because he could hear her saying it. Meredith eventually sent him a handwritten letter. I do not know exactly what it said because my father never showed me. He only told me she apologized for the way she spoke about the hospital ride. He mailed back a short note thanking her. He did not change the lease decision. By autumn, I had filed for divorce. It was not because of one SUV or one sentence. It was because that one sentence finally put a light on a pattern I had spent years refusing to see. Meredith and I divided things without a courtroom war. She kept the house because she wanted it and could refinance. I kept my company, my retirement account, and the old walnut dining table my father built for me when Megan was a baby. The strangest part was how little anger I felt by then. Anger had done its job early. It had gotten my attention. After that, what I felt was mostly relief. The following May, almost exactly a year after the hospital procedure, my father and I were sitting at Miller's Diner on a Saturday morning. He was 87 by then, and wearing the same blue windbreaker, even though the zipper had been broken since Christmas. His eye pressure was stable. He had finally hired the lawn service. Curtis sat 2 booths away with his wife and yelled over that my father still owed him new shocks for the Chevy. Dad yelled back that a man who drove that slowly could run square wheels and never notice. I had moved into a small house closer to town and started cutting my work week to 4 days. Megan visited more. I called my father more often, not because he needed monitoring, but because I had finally learned the difference between showing up from obligation and showing up because somebody matters. When the waitress brought our check, Dad reached for it. I put my hand on top of the paper first. He frowned and said, "I'm still your father." I said, "Then handle it yourself," and pushed the check toward him. For 1 second, he just stared at me. Then he laughed so hard he had to take off his glasses. I laughed too, and the words that had once sounded cold finally became something harmless because they were sitting between 2 people who had proven they would never leave the other one alone when it mattered. On the drive home, I thought about how close I had come to spending the rest of my life calling avoidance peace. I used to believe a good husband absorbed tension, smoothed things over, and kept everyone from getting upset. I do not believe that anymore. A good man can be patient. He can forgive. He can compromise more times than pride thinks he should. But there comes a point when keeping the peace means asking the kindest person in the room to keep paying for everybody else's comfort. And that is not peace. That is permission. My father never asked me to choose him over my wife. He never asked me to leave her. He never even asked for his old favor back. He simply stopped giving something that was being treated like an entitlement. The rest of us had to decide what that revealed about us. If you are a son, a husband, a father, or a brother who has spent years making excuses because confrontation feels worse than disappointment, I can tell you what I learned too late and right on time. Kindness is not a contract that requires you to keep giving after respect disappears. Sometimes the calmest thing you can do is stop arguing, stop explaining, and let people carry the weight of the choices they made. My wife told me my father was mine to handle. In the end, she was right about one part of that. He was my father, and when the moment came, I finally acted like his son.